So I'm here today to do a long overdue wrap up of the science fiction fantasy I've been reading recently. I have so much to talk about here. A bunch of new releases, some older titles. There are books that are very serious, a couple that are kind of silly, and I do think it's one of these wrap ups where hopefully there'll be something for everyone here. So if that sounds good, let's get started. Alright, first let's talk science fiction, starting with In Our Stars by Jack Campbell. This is the same author who wrote the Lost Fleet series, which I read the first book. I didn't entirely love it, so if you're someone who adores that series, know my own impressions going in so you know how to compare it to yours. This is the start of a new series, so you don't have to have read that one. In this one, it is set in a future where some individuals have the ability to have their bodies genetically engineered using alien DNA. However, not surprisingly, there's a lot of controversy around here, and so we follow a young woman who has had this done and of course is dealing with the prejudice and all of the aftermath. And then just in the setup of this book, so it's not a spoiler, there is a boiling point that is reached surrounding this whole controversy, which ends up leading to the annihilation of Earth. And so we follow the story then afterwards. We follow this young woman who of course is trying to hide her genetically enhanced body and really try to survive in the world afterwards. This is one that, despite that synopsis, I would describe as a rompy science fiction space opera. This is one that I honestly would recommend to those of you that love The Lost Fleet because I see a lot of similarities in the setup. It's a book that has a big consequence and kind of dire stakes. So if you love things like Mass Effect and all that and are looking for a story with a similar tone that is serious in nature but also feels kind of comforting, that's the reading experience I had with this one. It was strangely lighter in tone than I thought it should have been given the subject matter, but it kind of worked. Not a personal favorite of mine because of the fact that I enjoy more serious stories, and you would argue that what is more serious than the world being annihilated, but somehow this one just took a lighter tone that made it perhaps easier to digest, but for me, made the stakes not feel as big as they should be. But again, if you love this author, if you've read their other work and really enjoyed it, I do recommend this one because I think you're going to find similar things here and hopefully enjoy it a little bit more than I did. Let's talk next about Lost Ark Dreaming, which is a short sci-fi dystopian novella that follows a future where the waters are rising and then we're dealing with the aftermath of what to do, what the characters are trying to do to survive. This is one I picked up not knowing a lot about it. This is the same author who wrote Son of the Storm, which is a epic fantasy novel that I love from Orbit, so I was very excited to read more by them. And this one I went to with no expectations and ended up really enjoying it. It's dark and gritty, and it definitely leans into the dystopian aspects, so the darker side of humanity, the darker side of the world, the terrible things that we do for position. In terms of the setup, you can kind of see in the title, this one is loosely inspired by the ideas of Noah's Ark from the Bible, but this one is not at all religious in terms of the tones or themes beyond that. It's just kind of a starting place, but it's very much its own thing that feels very secular and just, again, exploring this dark future. Again, it just felt out of the box, original, the world building was great, and I'm always impressed what an author can do in a short package. You can see this is not a long book, and there was a lot packed in there. I found it to be interesting and the kind of book that I mull over, and kind of a sleeper hit of the year. I think more people should be reading this one. I think it's great, and will definitely consider reading more by this author, whatever they put out. At this point, they are well on their way to becoming a favorite. Next, we have The Water Knife, and this is by the same author who wrote The Wind-Up Girl, which is a dystopian biopunk story that I really love. And this is another one that is very much in the same vein. In this one, we follow a world with a very believable water shortage, and you see the aftermath of that, the grittiness and the inner fighting, and just challenges of having this resource be even more precious than it is today by obviously large margins. And so it's a dark story. It's quite a depressing story in that way. And I think for the most part, how you feel about the book, The Wind-Up Girl, is going to give you a good idea about how you'll feel about this one. I definitely saw huge similarities. Personally, I thought The Wind-Up Girl was a bit of a stronger story. I just think it had stronger characters and a bit more distinct in terms of some of the aspects of the world, and obviously the whole part with The Wind-Up Girl itself was something that really hit home in a very emotional way for me. But in this world, again, if you want to be utterly depressed, see an imagined future that is kind of horrific and you just can't look away, that's a very similar feeling that I had with this one. I would definitely read more by this author. I have to see what else is published by them. And so I'm glad I read this one, but wasn't the most fun read I've had, although I would argue that it wasn't supposed to be fun. So definitely one that's more on the serious side in this video. Next up is The Praxis by Walter John Williams, and this is the first book in a space opera series that is set in a future where there are these aliens, or have been these aliens, that have reigned supreme for a very long time. However, through circumstances, they are no longer going to be controlling the world. They are a dying race, and we see really what happens afterwards as this political system in the galaxy has been long established and is now crumbling, and people are running and scrapping to try to get position. It's a really interesting premise that plays out very well. I think this one has all the things I like in space opera. So it has some, again, really big stakes, a tone that felt serious with real consequences. You have characters that you're going to root for, or at least sympathize with, understand their motivations. And you have this really interesting, again, world building and political maneuvering. It kind of had everything and hit all those right spots. Now, it might just be my corner of the internet, but I hadn't personally heard about this series. I think someone recommended to me in the comments of a video I made, and I'm so glad, because I just, again, thought it was kind of a hidden gem. I feel like we recommend the same space operas over and over again, so it's always exciting to find something new. At this point, I've only read the first one. I think my library has a second book. I think it's a trilogy in total. So I will read what I can get my hands on, but even with only reading the first book, it was still worth my time. And I do recommend it if you've read all the big buzzy space operas, are looking for something a little bit more underhyped. This is one that in my mind is completely solid. Next up, let's switch to fantasy, starting with How to Become a Dark Lord and Die Trying by Django Wexler. And this is a book that is the start of a new, somewhat epic fantasy series, or at least a parody of epic fantasy. So the title kind of says it all. We follow an individual who is trying to become a Dark Lord, and right at the beginning of the story, we know that terrible things have happened to them, and so we follow them through their journey. This is one that I would recommend to those that love fantasy, love the tropes of fantasy, and specifically are looking for something that is silly, again, a satire, a parody, something that's going to be a funny take on that genre. And this one delivers exactly what you would expect. It is foul-mouthed, so you have to be okay with tons of swearing and F-bombs. It's very dialogue heavy. It's very humorous in terms of the way the narrative is played out. As I talked about, this one is definitely the silliest of the books I'm going to talk about in this video, because it's just ridiculous. If you want a serious plot, if you want to worry deeply for the characters, you're not going to get that. This book was, I believe, like a 3.5 star read for me, and that's simply because a book like this with this kind of tone isn't the kind that will hit that 5-star mark, but I can see other readers that have different tastes in me enjoying a lot more. I think it was accomplishing what it was trying to do. It's just not the kind of book that is just going to become an all-time favorite based off of what I like, because again, I like those more serious books, but I understand for a lot of people, they're looking for palate cleansers, they're looking for something cozier. And while it's definitely darker, like I said, it has like tons of swearing, it doesn't really have like cottagecore vibes or anything to that extent, but it feels a lot cozier compared to the typical grimdark. It has that humor to it. So if you're kind of looking for that escapist read, that out of the box read, the something different, I've read too many books of the Malazan series in a row and I need something to break it up, this is the kind of thing that I would recommend to those kind of readers. I think this is really gifty if you know someone who is a D&D fan or a fantasy nerd. This is definitely one that I feel comfortable to gift to the right reader. Next is Goddess of the River by Vaishnavi Patel, and this is a new book by a fantasy author I've read before. I read their other Indian-inspired fantasy story, Kakai, if I'm saying that right, and really enjoyed it. This one is very much in the same vein. This one follows a goddess of the river who is married off to a human man and the consequences of what happens after there. And so my understanding is that this very much is playing off of a traditional Indian myth, which is similar to what they did in their last book. And I do admit that other than the foreword at the beginning of the book, I was not familiar at all, so I can't comment on the accuracy or representation or those cultural elements from an own voice's perspective. It's just all very new to me, so I am reviewing this as someone who is experiencing this story for the first time in this format. And I will say that it does hold up on its own. I don't think you need to know the backstory, because I think the author provides you with all the world building and character development to have you follow along. It's very straightforward in terms of a narrative. This book, like their last book, is very feminist focused. And so specifically as we follow this woman, again, she has magical abilities and property and is then becomes a possession of this man. And you see as he really tries to strip her away from her identity family and make her lesser than she is forced or pressured to become a smaller version of herself in their marriage. And there is a lot of controversy surrounding her having children and just the layers that go into this story. So in terms of a narrative, it very much is a commentary on what happens to women, especially in more traditional like marriage companionship, and really seeing the place that women are often put into. The one complaint I do acknowledge with this book is it's very on the nose with those feminist themes. I was kind of in the mood to go rah rah, you get 'em girl, and kind of enjoy the book for what it was doing, but it is very heavy-handed with some simple themes surrounding female oppression. And I do wish the book had been a little bit more nuanced and thoughtful, just because I think it would attract a bigger audience that don't necessarily pick up like feminist fiction. And I feel like this one is going to be a bit of a barrier for especially men that just don't really think that that's their thing, because it is really in your face in a way that I think other books play with those themes, but they're less noticeable and they're kind of there if you want to pick them up and there if you want to dissect them. But I do think that this book might not be for everyone, just because I think it's just so heavy-handed in what it's trying to do, while I like a more kind of morally gray, complex story. And this one instead paints very stereotypical representations of both the male and female characters in this. So I ended up actually quite enjoying this one, had a good time reading it, but I do acknowledge that it has, I think, its flaws or its setbacks or things that will not appeal to other readers. So very much go into this one if that sounds fantastic. If you're like, yes, I want to read about female oppression, bring it on, let's discuss it. This book is great, but I can see it being a little bit on the nose for readers that are looking for something a little more subtle, because this book is not subtle at all. Next is The Fireborn Blade by Charlotte Bond, and this is a short fantasy novella that was sent to me by Tor.com, and in this one we follow a female knight who needs to go on this journey. She has to regain her honor, and so we follow her on this quest as she goes through it all. As I mentioned, this is a novella, so it's quite short in nature, so we get this little tightly packaged narrative, and I picked it up because it was heavily marketed as being this like female-driven knight story, where of course more traditional fantasy stories will have the knights being male as they would be historically. And so I was very interested in this one. The character in a way kind of reminded me of, like, you know, Brienne of Tarth from Game of Thrones, and kind of that female-centric woman breaking out of those traditional roles. So I liked it in that way, but there is that piece of, in 2024, I feel like there are so many stories about strong females breaking out of molds and breaking out of their traditional roles, that this just didn't feel as new and exciting and fresh as I wanted it to be. I think having a female in a traditionally male role is no longer enough to make a book that enticing to me, and I kind of wanted more from it. I think this book mostly just played it safe. It was a very traditional story that just happened to have a female character, and I wish that the author had done more, and I just felt like they relied too much on that being the thing of the story, as opposed to writing a narrative I haven't read before, having the character do something new that I haven't seen. And I found this one to be fine, but I've said before on my channel that for some readers, I respect that you just love fantasy and you just want to read fantasy story after fantasy story. This one might scratch that itch. For me, I've read a lot of traditional fantasy and I'm always looking for something a little bit more out of the box, and this one was just safely in the box of what I would expect from traditional fantasy, so it didn't really work as well for me. And finally, I read the whole trilogy that starts with Red Sister by Mark Lawrence, and this of course is a booktube darling. You probably know about it. Yes, it is nun assassin fantasy. We follow a young girl, Nona, who is taken in by these nuns and trained along the way. This series is gritty, the school is brutal, the world is more so, and you follow this young woman and her friends, or at least classmates or peers, and so they try to survive and struggle along through the world. I think this one has great cross appeal to those of you that love things like the Lies of Loch Lamore and kind of more intimate urban style fantasy. And so I overall really liked this one. I found it enjoyable, very action-packed, good narrative drive. It's one, I'll be honest, it didn't really challenge me in any way or make me think about fantasy or the themes or ideas. Didn't really reinvent or leave me mulling over the book. I don't think it's one that, for me, I found there wasn't as much to analyze or contemplate, which is something I often like in books books is when they make me reevaluate my morals and background and all of these things that can challenge me in reading. But for what it was trying to do, which in my mind is present an enjoyable narrative story that involves nuns and assassins, it's action-packed with good character work along the way, I think it was doing exactly what it was trying to do. I think it accomplished that, and I don't know if it's fair for me to want more from the series. So overall I gave it 4 stars, I believe, for the 3 books. And I've read Mark Lawrence before, I liked him, so I'll definitely continue to read his books when I kind of want that similar feel, just a good solid read in a world that's gritty, with characters that are gritty. Can you tell I like gritty books? And this one really just delivered what I was looking for, which is always a good thing. So that's it for this video here. You know the drill. Let me know what books you plan on reading that I talked about today. I love all of your opinions. Agree, disagree, let's discuss down below. If you're new to my channel, I hope you stick around, subscribe, hit that little button. You can also hit the bell button so you don't miss videos from me. Sometimes I put out extra content, sometimes, not this week, but it happens occasionally. And if you want to stick around, I appreciate a big thumbs up. You can drop an emoji in the comments, lets me know you're here. Otherwise, if you enjoyed this, I will talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.